in this way. And thank you. Thank you for very short notice in a very, very tight schedule. I know that at this time you are transitioning and reviewing and finding a way to continue the multi-choice talent factory in a virtual platform and many other programs. But you afforded us your time and we thank you deeply. And I couldn't think of anyone better to be the final and last speaker of this Imbizo. I'm creative _ Imbizo. That represents the African spirit. Femi is the creative leader of not just Lagos and Nigeria, but the continent. Nigeria actually carries the entire continent when it comes to the film industry. And Femi is one of the leading experts and professionals in film industry. I have been to Lagos a couple of times. I've worked with him closely. So much respect. But above everything else, I have listened to him speaking about storytelling, speaking about the heart of that shapes the industry of films, and speaking about story. There's this piece that he wrote, I think it was last year beginning or the other year, about story. And today I said, can you help us to reframe our stories about COVID-19? And he decided to title his presentation, Storytelling in the COVID-19 Era. What did you say? How did you frame it?
Medicine or poison.
Medicine or poison. So over to you. Your closing speaker.
Thank you.
Rock on, all the energy, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, so much for the opportunity to be here, Dr. P. You know I have a world of respect for your contribution to a lot of my learning, especially in the area of how we create safe spaces for our students at the Multi-Choice Talent Factory. I think it was gorgeous that you were the first we rallied, we put in the middle of the village square to tell us how we pass on to our students the code of honor, how our spaces would be, how they would learn. And you've come down to Lagos and done that and gone to Kenya and to Zambia, but you've done it with such passion, and I am just so grateful. So you couldn't have asked me anything I wouldn't say yes to. And I think it's so important that you've also included creative people in this conversation, because I think often we have these conversations and everybody at the table is either a trainer, a teacher, a professor, a design thinker, and we've learned quite a lot from our lineup today. It's been really incredible. But I'm really excited to be able to just talk briefly about how I think COVID-19 and what the whole world is going through together, how I think it's shaping how our stories emerge post-COVID-19. I have just a few slides, but the few slides I'm just gonna, let me just try and see if I can get it onto the bit here quickly, and then just a moment. I want to do this quickly. I hope I can. Trying to share. Come on now. Just a moment, trying to get my sharing there. Just a moment. Yes. Okay. Does that work? Can everybody see that? Okay. So.
Yes.
Excellent. So basically, this is one conversation that I think, the creative industries across Africa are going to have, and I'm so glad that if nothing else, we're triggering that conversation at this session. I'm so happy as well that a lot of our students from the Multi-Choice Talent Factory are here, and they will tell you that if there is anything that we've been trying to nail down, is the power of storytelling to do a whole host of things. And storytelling, not just as a filmmaker, not just as a book author, not just as a photographer, not just as a people who do sculpture or whatever, but storytelling as a partnership with an audience. Storytelling as a set of codes through which we speak from a place of shared images and shared understanding and shared gestures. The code for storytelling comes from not just the writer, but from the audience itself. So storytelling, in effect, is a community engagement. And that works very much if you understand that across the world, and Africa especially. Storytelling is really how we validate our identity, how we validate our view of the world, how we translate our experiences, how we capture our history. So there is so much that storytelling does for us beyond entertainment, that every time we have a situation that we have now with COVID-19, where we are forced into a reset, while it affects, it shifts the ground for many other industry, for the industry of storytelling, for storytellers and for the audiences, it's actually a bigger seismic shift. It actually upends everything that we share, upon which we build our storytelling. And as I thought through this, I was looking through all the stories that people are telling, especially now with social media, WhatsApp, online, everywhere. There seems to be a storyteller emerging who is either translating or transliterating what is going on with COVID-19. There is this now connection between fear, between hope, between also those who wish to, how shall I say, create some kind of disempathy. Because there are people as well who think that COVID-19 is a wonderful leveler. The inequalities that emerge, that we're using to address COVID-19, wash your hand. Obviously, you have to be in a place where you actually have water. You know, stay at home, you have to have a home. So there are all kinds of emerging story strands in COVID-19 that I have found to be very interesting, especially as a film teacher, as someone who have students who we are giving assignments to try to document this global experience. And one of the most interesting part of this is the fact that storytelling relies on the journey of a character. And what we're experiencing is that the character in the age of isolation has no other character to work against that is not virtual. The whole space of the character itself in storytelling has shifted. The idea of isolation used to be something that is agreed between the storyteller and the audience as a punishment. When you hear that someone has been put in isolation, whether it's a kid, it's because the kid, was a bit troublesome. If you hear that someone is in prison but is in isolation, you mentally understand that that's a very dangerous criminal. So how does it feel when ordinary people are in isolation? For those of us who are learned, who are educated, we can mentally process why we are in isolation. We can mentally process the factual stories about COVID-19, but what about Africa, where not everybody have the mental or the educational background to be able to pull out from their own toolbox the logical reasons for this? So for me, the storytelling of COVID-19 breaks into three parts. It's going to be, how do we capture, number one, the whole story of this, i.e. what is happening. Of course, that in itself is got many sides to it. Depends on whether you're a Chinese sympathizer or you're an American sympathizer, or Africa, where we simply did not know what was going on until it happened. But then there is the individual experiences of those who have not suffered, who have not been infected with COVID-19. There is the individual experiences of us whose normal life have been upended and become abnormal. We wake up in the morning, and instead of going off into Lagos traffic, I don't have to. And I find that I don't have a backup set of gestures or behavior because for so many years, I have done exactly the same thing with the same expectation of what happens to me between 6 o'clock and 8 a.m. And the idea that I cannot start work until I sit behind a table, all of that, our normal has been shifted into abnormal. Everybody is trying to process this. We're in a house now where you have to deal with the fact of family as something that you have to be present in. That in itself shifts a lot of our storytelling. Our codifying. How do we storify basic things like family? How do we storify things like working? How do we storify things like supervision? How do we storify education, going to school? How do we storify learning? The whole storification process has shifted. Who is a protagonist has shifted. Who is an antagonist has shifted, because now COVID-19 is an antagonist we cannot even see. So, and this is very important for us because we're dealing also with a mutation of everything that we thought we knew. A mutation of, for instance, which occupations are more important. Of course, you look at how people are paid pre-COVID-19, you think that it is the guys who are like CEOs of companies or football players or musicians or celebrities. And suddenly we find that the nurse that we haven't paid so well, the doctor that is earning so poorly, emerges as a heroic character. So essentially what is also being upended are our value systems. In places like Nigeria, where those value systems, those codes of shared understanding with the audiences have been almost set in stone and rendered across our Nollywood film industry, for instance. And this is very important because Nollywood and the audience essentially co-create. And so for me, the final thing to say before I move on with the slide is the idea that because we're co-experiencing these times, how do you not understand that the creative process itself is going to mutate into something that is only a co-creation process? And that's really significant because remember, the emergence of the internet, the emergence of platforms online already removed one very important gate in the distribution process. It used to be that curators decided where our stories could go. And the new world upended that, such that the filmmaker or the storyteller or the book person could actually now connect directly with an audience across the world. So the curator no longer exists. But now what COVID-19 is also doing is the creator also now has to understand that the audience is no longer passive. The audience is no longer waiting for the story to be told to them. Because we are co-experiencing this and everything is shifting, the audience itself has also become a storyteller. So co-curating will be where we're going next. And I think that's very, very significant and important. What I know will not shift is the hunger for meaning. Why do we tell stories? Why do people want stories told? Why do we, in a major global experience like COVID-19, the stories that everyone now hungers for are stories that addresses what we are all going through. Because beyond the fear, beyond the hope, beyond the deaths and you know, the sadness, beyond the confusion, are many, many questions that seem to upend everything that we used to believe. And this is very important for countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where the lack of infrastructure has deepened our reliance on things that cannot be measured. Religion, heritage things, you know, ancestors and all these things. And we've used those things to sort of continue to sort of fan the embers of hope. And what we're experiencing now is that COVID-19, isolation, everything that we held on to for hope, for faith, is also sort of being taken from our grasp. So the whole idea of helplessness, beyond just confusion, beyond just unanswered questions, the helplessness of the moment surround all the things that we hold dear. Why would a church go down in an earthquake? I mean, after all, we're serving God. Why do good people who have no pre-existing condition, who have not behaved badly, who are not on drugs, who don't drink, how come they can contract this thing they cannot see in just the regular order of their lives and within 2-3 days be dead? How are we expected to relate to things that, you know, happen that we did not cause? And all of this is where storytelling is going to be needed, not just to record the factuality of what has happened or what is happening, but to address that which we're trying to find a meaning for. That to me is going to be something that makes post-COVID, and by post-COVID, I mean when we have found a vaccine, when whatever is now the new normal emerges. Of course, what is also clear is that the new normal would require us to define what it is. Because in the new normal, all the gestures, all the codes, everything that we understand and use for storytelling beyond words, beyond elaborate action, are going to change. Not only are they going to change, we have to motivate that change in the quest of our storytelling. And I think that is going to be the most important conversation that storytellers across the spectrum have to start having now. Is a kiss still going to be a kiss? Is a kiss going to be a gesture of affection? Is being tactile a sense of being comfortable with the other character? How far is social distancing going to sip and engulf how we relate? We certainly know that how we work would certainly be permanently changed. There's a lot of things that we now know is possible. How we go to school is going to be permanently changed. Of course, religion is going to be permanently changed because my old mother, for instance, called me on Easter. She's 81, and she was incredibly amused by the fact that this was the first time in 81 years that she had not been in a church on Easter Day. And then she smiled ruefully and said to me, God really is everywhere. Now, that's interesting because on the Friday that went past as well, I saw an image from Saudi Arabia where the Kaaba was entirely empty. And Muslims are about to start the Ramadan fast. And I saw something from Saudi Arabia that said, it looks like the prayers for the Ramadan would all be done in our homes. So effectively, storytelling is going to have to now represent images that are not only about characters that act and do things, but it has to also navigate for us how characters are processing things. So there's going to be a lot that's going to happen that has nothing to do with all the tools we've been using. And those tools, obviously, like words, tools like gestures, tools, like action, are going to be affected. Which is why everything we've been talking about today has been such a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. Because the characters that we create now have to be far more three-dimensional. It's not just about what the character is doing. The concept of the motivations and the concept of the present engagement internally of that character with the outside world becomes level 1 and 2. And the responses of the character or the characters that are engaging them has nothing to do with external things anymore. So I said to my friend and colleague and boss, Cheryl, earlier today, how excited I am to simply talk about one thing today about storytelling. What COVID-19 has done is that it is now going to insist on subliminality in our storytelling. It is not going to just be the description of what happened. It is not just going to be turning points of what happened after something happened. It is now going to be almost a journey into the spaces of the mind, spaces of the heart, of the feelings of our characters. And so psychology, the inner spaces, how our characters' view of the world is shaped by their previous experiences. We now have to figure out a way to represent this visually, when in fact, we have no practice. I find that to be a very interesting thing, because one of the things that I was thinking about 2 days ago is how, if you look at what's sinking in this new age of subliminal storytelling, everything that we normally rely on is what's sinking down to the bottom of the pool. Gestures, expressions, words, they're going to still be needed, but they're going to be secondary. There's going to now be that three-dimensionality to the spaces and location, such that other things are now important for us to read where this character might be going, or how this character is experiencing things. So what used to be the things that only directors have to worry about, like shapes, like lines, like symbols, like sounds. You know, these are the things that the director brought to the table before, whilst the writer simply gave us a narrative that basically identified what these characters were doing and how they expressed themselves and the words that they used. And all of that is going to be up for reset. And that's a major shift, whether you're an artist, a writer, a filmmaker, you know, a documentary person. Now, where the character chooses to stand against what he chooses to stand, all of this become codes that we must now reinvent in a co-creation space with our new audiences. I think it's so fundamental and so amazing that it is a question and a conversation that I am happy that, you know, you've engendered with us, because it's a conversation we are going to carry over to the Multi-Choice Talent Factory, because we've got responsibility for this new generation of storytellers to be ahead of the curve, to begin to think in terms of what are the tools that are now in their hands to shape the stories of the future. So subliminality is going to be the real art of creative language. And it's going to be that way, whether you're looking at an artwork or you're listening to a documentary or you're listening to a piece of music. How we describe experiences are going to change, because now it almost has to be not just, it has to be visually accessible, not just by the principal image or the principal character, but placed against what? Because that's going to be the first thing, how we now begin to, shall I say, mine meanings. And that's not just in imagery, it's going to be also in sound, it's going to be in poetry, in how we describe things. 2 meanings to every shot. And now I'm talking to those who are in cinema who are here. The trick is no longer going to be that this one shot was what you intended. You will need to understand that there is a meaning relative to your representation. Why? Because the audiences now are beginning to look at things, not just using their ears, not just using their eyes, but engaging it with their minds. And that to me is really going to change how sequences are represented. And I think that's very, very important, because in cinema, for instance, and in a lot of storytelling, sequences are shots that we've put together where the totality, the aggregate of them ends in a meaning. But now it's going to be individual shots, because, you know, now our audiences understand not just the movement, they're not just waiting to the end of the sequence, they're actually more or less vetting as that sequence unfolds. The third thing is the referencing. The idea that historical references are going to now become an interesting piece of business. Why? Because, again, what was, what is, what will be are now three distinct pillars. And we will still need historical references, but it looks to me like we're in a situation where by the time COVID-19 is done, Nigeria, for instance, whose generation of young people is 60%, might begin to inch up to like 70, 80%. If definitely our older folks are the ones who are in the biggest danger, and if our health infrastructure, for instance, in Nigeria, as it is in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, is as inadequate as it is, by the time the curve of this thing is flattened, more than likely we'll be like Italy, which then means that access in memory to historical referencing will become something of how do I say it? Something that we have to re-educate with. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because we do need a lot of our young people to connect more with the references of the history, because a lot of them are disconnected from it, which explains, you know, the long lines for visas at embassies. Maybe that's an opportunity right there, because again, but there has to be now stories, and referencing becomes a big issue, not just at the point of visual exposition, as you would imagine with an art director, but from the very ideation itself. Lastly, sounds are going to start to mean a lot, or the lack of it. One of the things that our audiences are getting used to, especially in Nigeria, is the sound of silence. When you're isolated, you're also becoming you're becoming conditioned to something that was not our previous experience. If you lived where I live, you live in Lagos, you're very, very used to just, there's always a secondary thing in your head of cars moving and things happening and call to prayers and churches talking. And there's always 3 levels of sound and noise everywhere. And we're Africans, we shout, we talk. And now COVID-19 is reculturalizing our capacity to simply be quiet. Not silent, to be quiet. And I think the quietness is going to enhance how we use symbols, how we use music, how we use sounds, how we not use sound, how we use, eye contacts, how do we deal with spaces? Because now, in storytelling, there's always that bit where we say that the spatial relationship between 2 characters lets you know the level of their intimacy. When you're doing a love story, obviously, you start off with them being far apart, and as they get closer, you close down the space until, they're really close. Of course, when they're far apart and don't know each other well, they speak loudly, and the closer they get, it becomes a whisper. And we've used this in film training and storytelling as how spatiality is a shared code, that the wider, when people also grow apart in marriages, as they head towards divorce, their spaces increase. But of course, that's already revolutionized now, because social distancing becomes something we must reiterate in cinema. So it's really the art of film language is going to change in a fundamental way. But there are 2 things I think that are going to remain important in even in our subliminality. One is our exposition. The idea that we will continue to need research. We will continue to be able to embrace, along with the audience, a background of facts. That's very important to note, because creativity in terms of how we look at fictional storytelling, we've accepted that it's something of an inspiration, and we can create a world no matter what that world looks like. The audience, the contract with the audience is that they must suspend disbelief and embrace this inspirational creation. I think in the new post-COVID storytelling world, there is going to be that we establish a framework, that the audience is not going to simply suspend disbelief to the extent that they used to. So that's very important. Now, it may be not all of this, obviously, are stuff that are going to be proven when we get there. But there are also stuff that have to be part of our ideation debate now, because essentially any one of us who's teaching or who's mentoring storytellers must understand that if you carry what we know now and the structures of how we do it into the post-COVID era, it will be too late because the audience are ahead of the curve. The second thing is that, you know, good exposition will have to be embedded in a way that the audience doesn't the facts are not in their faces. It is something that they simply feel is in the flow of your understanding. And it's how they are going to be able to connect with it is that they're co-curating, they're co-creating with you. Therefore, it's easier if they think you are in the flow of what the background of facts that they share historically or contemporarily is. The second thing, obviously, would be juxtapositions. I already talked about sequencing and how audiences had to wait for meaning at the end. Now, everything will have what I call implied meanings. There's going to be for everything, for shots, for sounds, for objects. And each time each one is placed one to the other, there is going to be an interpretation of that. And why is this? Because this experience that we all share is causing even our most illiterate audiences to be more reflective, to think deeper, to see beyond the ordinary, to begin to, shall I say, engage within their own head. And so the whole idea of suspension of disbelief becomes something that will also be entirely redefined, you know, as we go forward. So there are a few things that led me to, that would become very important to storytellers as we go forward from this experience. What is fiction, what is fact, will become just a question of emotional literation of experiences, because some of the people who are suffering Code 19, for instance, talk about hallucinations, talk about dreams and thoughts and stuff that they experience to be real, but the doctor says to them never happened. There are experiences in the isolation centers, and I'm in the midst of research now because I hopefully will be starting a documentary on this whole thing where we're trying to see if we can just document the experiences, because this particular virus seems to live a different kind of experience with different people. And so we will find that in the mix of that storytelling, the storytellers will find that the lines of separate fiction and fact will become thinner as we move along. The second theme is how we say conflict is at the heart of storytelling. Well, I think it's also going to become a situation where a little bit of conflating also occurs, where what is conflict becomes reliterated. The simpler things of a conflict being something that simply upended someone's normal to abnormal becomes up for debate. What is abnormal? The issues of, oh, you know, this man wants these values of life and this is what is going to stop them, and that's the inciting incident for our story, becomes something that is also up for negotiation. So the concept of conflict is going to, it used to be that we'll say to students, no, you're conflating and that's a problem. Well, that might no longer be a problem in the process of our storytelling. The third thing, especially for Africans, is the concept of the physical and the metaphysical. It's something that's interesting to me because one of the things that everyone used to hold against Nollywood films was that it told stories where sometimes the antagonist or the protagonist of the story was a spirit, couldn't be seen. Well, it looks to me now that COVID is introducing the concept of the metaphysical to the entire world. The idea that your life can change by contact with something that you do not see. Now, that to me is going to be a very interesting effect on how stories are told, especially in Africa. Because for me, I think it's important that we embrace what I consider to be the heart of our storytelling, the idea that its three-dimensionality was not only restricted to the physical, and the idea that we know and we believe that we ourselves are spirits, and that we can engage in a timeless sequence with those who went before us and those that are yet to come into this physical world. So that to me is going to also become something that would be discussed and debated in how we shape stories going forward. All of that, when you put that together, brings me to the place where I say, going forward, will storytelling in the new age, post-COVID-19, would it be poison or would it be medicine? And I think my answer to that is that it's going to be, in the immediate term, a little bit of both. A little bit of both, because we are going to constantly have stories emerging and changing in its narrative essence. Its fact and its fiction are going to be blurry. The lines are going to blur between, the physical and the metaphysical, which is what you're already seeing online with social media. The idea that people are not just dealing with scientific facts, they also are willing, intelligent people are willing to forward and build stories around untested solutions, around rumors about things they heard and what they said happened there or here. Because what is going to make it poison, interestingly, is the empowerment of our ability to create an audience for ourselves, by ourselves, and understand that some of them might actually just follow us without any measure of authentication or question or debate. So it falls to those of us who are in the storytelling business to ensure that, the stories of COVID-19, the imageries, the gestures, capture things in their essence, try to address unanswered questions as much as can be answered today, but be there to document this season where all of us as characters are beginning to go inside more and perhaps emerge to be more authentic than when we were able to control our internal and external spaces in storytelling. So really, that's the essence of what I came here to say. But I wanted to show as well a small video, which is very interesting, probably costs nothing. But if you just look at it for Nigeria, I considered it to be one of the most powerful, inspirational pieces that was circulated. And all that was done was that a video was repurposed. It embraced the nature of Nigeria's lack of readiness for this thing. It embraced the issue of the big, nations, the fear, the idea that this thing has flawed the big nations. And it proposed the concept that for us to survive this, we're going to be, shall we say, we would have to come to this with a homegrown solution. So I'm just going to play that for you, and then I'll sit back for your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you. I hope this plays. Okay. Can you see the video though? Hello?
Yes, we can see the video.
But it's not playing. Oh dear.
You just have to press play.
Where is the play? I can't see it. Is it playing?
No, it's not playing.
Oh. I can't see a button to make it work. I'm just gonna push play.
The display looks so perfect. It's as if, don't you just need to hover over the video and then play?
If I stop video, I suppose it
No,
just
I'm
stops.
saying hover over the video with the mouse, and then play might come up, might show up, the play icon for the video.
No, I'm working with a touch screen, and
Oh.
and it's not working. Well, that's a shame. I'm very sorry. I can't seem to figure out how to do this properly, unfortunately. Okay, let me see if I can.
You can also share the YouTube clip, the link with with us on the chat. Then we can play.
Okay. Let me see if I can quickly do that. Okay, this is totally, it's a bit totally whack now, so. Trying to get out of this now so I can actually do that, get out of that. Okay, let me just find a link and do this differently. I'm just gonna send it quickly. Let me see if I can send it to you.
As a link.
Yes. Okay. I can't seem to find this link now, it seems. Well, you know what? I will figure out a way. Let's just, because I think I've already chewed up most of my time anyway. But essentially, it's a very short, relabeled video that I think, did a lot for a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of how the audience engages imagery and sequencing. I guess I'll just get away from this and try and see if I can take a couple of questions before my time runs out and be done. Okay.
Yes, please do that, Femi. If you can check in the Q&A box, there's a bunch of questions there for you.
I'm going there. Yeah. 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 Oh, okay. Somebody actually saw the video. So, hey, where are the questions? I'm trying to see them.
The person who has seen the video, you can just pop the YouTube link on the chat. Then we'll try and play it from our computers. But in the meantime, this should happen while Femi is responding to the questions.
Okay,
so
the first question, Regine says, will the nature of storytelling naturally become more authentic because of the multidimensional impact of isolationism and this jarringly forced softening and unnatural ideation? Yes, I believe so. I truly believe so. I think that what will come out of this is that our audiences are going to be far more reflective. They're not going to simply take anything on the face values anymore. And I think it's interesting if you look at how people were in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown. I mean, they were like, wild animals, fighting against the gates. And by the third week, everybody sort of calmed down. Everybody's just sort of able to sit down longer in reflection. So there is a multidimensional impact to it, that's for sure. So I do think that that will reflect not just how storytelling is done, but how storytelling is also consumed. The second question says, does conflict refer to mix, blend, and merge? Yes. That's when you take two opposing truths and try to, like, you know, bring them together. You know, sometimes we talk about parallel lines, and we try to ensure that, you know, when you're in the previous years, we would say to the writer that you can't confuse the audience in terms of, you know, where you started and what you said your conflict was. But I think there is also, that would be also a function of how more intelligent, more reflective, more deep the audiences will become. Because guess what? The audiences themselves will also become storytellers. So there's a lot that all of us are going to go through here, where the lines are not going to be as distinct as perhaps they used to be. Deborah says, you mentioned that the line between facts and fiction will become slimmer. I hope I've shed enough light with just these other questions I've answered. You will have to base your ideation on a world that is relatable. But the idea of what I think is going to be an interesting space is going to be now, how do you get into the inside of your characters to sort of unearth motivations? That's really where that line will blur. And I think it would be an interesting thing to explore. As far as I'm concerned, everything that I'm saying to you are the things that I hope all storytellers are sort of thinking about, wondering about. So everything I'm talking about are more questions than they are answers, because really, I'm not so sure that anybody would sit here and be able to give you all the answers. But I am certainly quite willing to face the questions, as it were. Dawn says, might this be a perfect time for older family members to share family stories and histories with the younger generation? And it's not necessary to sit them down and tell them, but to have conversation which they will strain to overhear. I certainly think so. I think there's going to be now a sense of, until we resolve this, and I'm not so sure that this virus will be the last of the dislocation that the world would see. As long as we're still, and I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, please, but as long as we're into the business of biological warfare, chemical warfare, there will always be something beyond, you know, a market where, you know, wild animals interact with, you know, like Wuhan, like everybody was initially made to believe. But the truth is, science will become very important, because we're not going to be so sure that everybody will live, you know, the expected life expectancy will become, shall I say, fluid issue, because it does not mean that just because you have a heart attack or you have a good heart, it might not mean that you live long. Everything might have to do with how scientifically educated you are about all these strains and stuff that are happening out there. So I do think responsibility for not only storytelling, but for archiving stories around identity would become responsibility that everyone takes seriously. What do storytellers ensure they don't tell as stories in times like this? Whew, okay, that's a tricky question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think, you know, there's not going to be no-go areas. It's all going to be, we're going to need all stories. It is how we tell them and how impactful they are and the expectation of our process of ideation that I'm talking about. So all stories will be legitimate to be told. We're going to have years and years of stories that, you know, take us through in an empathetic way the things that we didn't see while we were isolated. Lives and struggles and all kinds of unpredictabilities and passions that we never got to experience ourselves will be rich fodder for stories. I think that's all the question I can see here. Marley's asked earlier in the chat box about the term exposition. Well, yeah, more detail about expositions. I mean, those who, if you're a storyteller, exposition is basically your premises. The premise upon which you want the audience to base everything on. In the old days, you could simply create that from nothing. And these days, you have to like work with where the mind of the audience, the reader or the viewer is. It will simply be that, you know, you have to almost be able to engage the experiences in a much deeper way for the codes of that exchange to be valid and for them to access where your story is going a bit faster. Okay.
Thanks, Femi. We're gonna try and play that clip. I think Mark has got the clip. Mark, do you want to try and play it for us, please?
I'm done with the questions anyway, so that's fine.
And just take hold there, and the throat. Good one. Back with the others. Right, nice. Next one, please. That's good. Okay, going yourself down. And take hold. And the throat. That's nice. Good. There we go. Okay, can I have the next one, please? Next one, please. Yeah. Just sit forward then. Yeah. Onto the mat. Yeah. There we are. And the other foot. Yeah. That's good. That's all right now. Okay, here we just come back onto the mat. There we go. It's all right. First the bow. All right, and then I take hold. It's all right. Just trust me. Just calm down. Just stand here. That's it. No one's gonna get it. That's good. Okay. So, yeah. Just one big bow, then the throw. Okay. So one. Then.
Okay, very same video. Very same video had Nigeria on it. Now, that was created, in my understanding, by a viewer who evidently is able to look at the multiple layers of gestures and read this thing straight out of an old video and simply put graphics on it, and it worked perfectly too. And it worked for both Nigeria and evidently South Africa. Probably they did that for many other countries as well. So Anyway, thank you. That's that. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but I think I am. What do I? Okay, Joshua So says, what do you think will be the commercial potentials of stories based on the reality before the pandemic, in the post-pandemic era? Well, I do think that, you know, there would always be commercial potential for stories well told. The trick is, are we going to still be going to cinemas? I'm not sure. It's the channels of that, that engagement with the audience that I fear might already have pushed reset. I have a friend who is the managing director of Genesis Cinema, and since the beginning, from the very, very beginning, everybody has sort of left the cinemas. Nobody's gone to the cinemas. Will the seating arrangements be the same when COVID is gone? How long will it take our fears to subside? Will we not need to sort of invest more on how audiences are watching content now? What does that mean for the cable companies, television? What does that mean for, you know, content creators themselves? What will your set look like in another 2 years? I have no answers. I just know that it's easier to pay for what you like than it was before. People will keep consuming stories and they will pay for it. The question is, are you telling the stories they wish to consume? To me, that would continue to be the issue. To Dawn, is conflating and transliterating the same thing? Kind of. Americans will call it a spin, yes, but it's a bit more formalized and obviously clearer in terms of, you know, sometimes Americans use the word spin as dressing up a falsehood, or spin is what a used car salesman does, sort of idea. It might be a bit deeper than that. Do we need more lightness and laughter in film then? We're going to need it. We're going to need, one of the things that makes that video that that was shown to you work is the laugh lines. We're going to absolutely, totally need that as the entry into stories. I think it's going to be important more than ever that you're able to humorize your characters. It's going to be important, much more, not as just a type of genre of filmmaking. It would have to be embedded in all filmmaking, perhaps outside of horror. I can't see any other questions, so I think I'm good. In the absence
on the hour. No more questions, and it's clear. Excellent. And it's 9 o'clock. And after a day like this, you closed it so perfectly. And thank you for sharing your insights. We deeply appreciate you, Femi. Thank you.
Thank you.